Uncle Tom smiled at me. "How's life after that $3.8 million patent sale?" My sister stopped bragging about her new Honda. My parents exchanged panicked looks. Mom whispered, "What patent?" I calmly sipped my wine as Uncle Tom continued, and I watched the color drain from my father's face like someone had pulled a plug at the bottom of his soul. The Thanksgiving table at our River Oaks estate went silent, except for the sound of my cousin dropping her fork onto the bone china. And I realized this was the moment I'd been engineering for exactly 9 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days. Every second of humiliation, every stolen idea, every condescending smile from my own family had led to this precise instant where I held all the cards and they didn't even know the game had started. My name is Lily Whitmore, and until last November, I was the family disappointment. Not because I'd failed at anything, but because I'd succeeded at the wrong things. My sister Vanessa had married a petroleum executive, produced 2 perfect children, and bought a Mediterranean-style mansion in Memorial. My brother James ran a hedge fund downtown and drove a Bentley he parked in a climate-controlled garage. Meanwhile, I had a PhD in biomedical engineering from Rice University, worked 80-hour weeks in a lab, and lived in a modest townhouse in Montrose that my mother literally apologized for when her friends asked where I lived. At 32, I was the cautionary tale my parents told at cocktail parties, the brilliant daughter who'd wasted her potential on science instead of society. What they didn't know was that for the past 6 years, I'd been developing a revolutionary filtration system for water purification in my spare time. Not at my university lab, but in a converted garage space I rented under a different name. I'd learned early that my family had a particular talent for taking credit for things that weren't theirs, a trait I'd discovered the hard way when my father had stolen my undergraduate thesis on polymer chemistry and presented it as his own consulting work to one of his clients. I was 19 and stupid enough to believe his explanation that he was just proud of me and wanted to share my brilliance. It took me 3 years and a shattered sense of trust to understand that in my family, love was transactional and success was a zero-sum game. The patent sale Uncle Tom mentioned wasn't supposed to be public knowledge yet. I'd specifically structured the deal with a water technology firm to keep my name out of the press for exactly this dinner, this moment. But Uncle Tom worked in intellectual property law, and he had connections everywhere. He'd apparently done his homework when he saw the filing, traced it back to me through layers of LLC paperwork, and decided that Thanksgiving dinner was the perfect time to drop a conversational bomb. I could have kissed him. Instead, I took another sip of the 2015 Chateau Margaux my father had been saving for a special occasion, and waited for someone to break the silence. Vanessa recovered first, her perfectly microbladed eyebrows drawing together in confusion. Lily has a patent? For what, like science stuff? The dismissiveness in her voice was automatic, a reflex she'd developed over years of positioning herself as the successful daughter. She'd been homecoming queen at St. John's, had debuted at the coronation ball, and never worked a day in her life unless you counted managing household staff and planning charity galas. In Vanessa's world, real success meant marrying well and maintaining appearances, and my laboratory work was just an expensive hobby our parents indulged because they felt guilty about something they'd never quite articulated. "A water filtration system," Uncle Tom said, helpfully, clearly enjoying himself. "Revolutionary stuff, apparently. The company that bought it thinks it could change disaster relief operations worldwide. They're already in talks with FEMA and the UN. He turned to me with genuine warmth. "I've got to say, Lily, I always knew you were the smartest one in this family. Glad to see you getting the recognition you deserve." My mother's hand trembled as she reached for her wine glass. She was a beautiful woman, even at 60, with the kind of maintained elegance that money and good surgeons could buy. But right now, she looked like someone had told her the stock market had crashed. "Lily, sweetheart, why didn't you tell us about this?" Her voice had that wounded quality she deployed when she wanted to make you feel guilty for her own emotions. "We're your family. We should have known. We could have celebrated with you." This was the part that almost made me laugh. Celebrated with me. Like they'd celebrated when I graduated summa cum laude from Rice. Oh, wait, they hadn't come to that ceremony because it conflicted with Vanessa's baby shower. Or like they'd celebrated when I'd won a prestigious research fellowship, except they'd spent that dinner talking about James's promotion and how proud they were that he'd finally made partner at his firm, even though he was 35 and had bought his way in with family money. Every achievement I'd ever had was either minimized, ignored, or somehow reframed as less important than whatever my siblings were doing. "I wanted it to be a surprise," I said, keeping my voice light and easy. "Besides, you know how these things are. I wasn't sure it would actually go through." This was a complete lie. I'd known for 6 months that the deal was solid, that the company was desperate for my technology, and that I was about to become very, very wealthy. I'd spent those 6 months planning exactly how I wanted this moment to unfold, and Uncle Tom's loose lips had just accelerated my timeline by about 3 weeks. Sometimes the universe gives you gifts, and you just have to be smart enough to accept them. My father finally spoke, and his voice had an edge I recognized. $3.8 million is a lot of money, Liliana. He only used my full name when he was trying to assert authority. "I hope you've talked to a financial advisor. You're going to need help managing that kind of windfall. Tax implications alone will be complex. I can have my guy give you a call on Monday." Already trying to insert himself into my success, to position himself as the wise patriarch guiding his naive daughter through the complicated world of wealth. It was so predictable it was almost boring. "Already handled, Dad. I've got an excellent team at Goldman Sachs managing the portfolio. They've been great." I watched his jaw tighten. Goldman Sachs meant I'd gone to New York, to real money managers, not to his good old boy network of Texas wealth advisors who all played golf together and traded insider information over bourbon. It meant I'd stepped outside the family sphere of influence, and for a man who prided himself on controlling his children's lives through financial dependencies and social pressure, that was a direct threat. James leaned back in his chair, trying to look casual, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was doing math, trying to figure out how my net worth now compared to his, wondering if I'd suddenly become more valuable in the family hierarchy. "So what are you going to do with all that money? Finally get yourself a decent house? Maybe join River Oaks Country Club?" There was an attempt at lightness in his tone, but underneath it was something harder, something that sounded uncomfortably like resentment. "I'm thinking about starting a foundation. There's a lot of need for clean water technology in underserved communities, both internationally and right here in Texas. Did you know there are still towns in the Rio Grande Valley that don't have access to safe drinking water? I'd like to change that." I said this knowing it would annoy them, knowing that actual philanthropy, the kind that wasn't just about getting your name on a museum wing or a hospital building, was foreign to their understanding of charity. My parents donated to causes that got them invited to the right parties. I was talking about actually changing lives. Vanessa's husband, Trevor, spoke up for the first time. He was usually quiet at these dinners, content to let his wife dominate the conversation, but now he looked at me with something approaching respect. "That's actually really cool, Lily. If you need any connections in that space, I might be able to help. We do some corporate responsibility work in that area." I nodded politely, knowing I'd never take him up on it, but appreciating the gesture. Trevor was okay. He was just trapped in a marriage with my sister, which was its own special kind of punishment. My mother was still processing, her social calculator working overtime. "Well, this is just wonderful news, honey. Really wonderful. We should have a party to celebrate. Something at the club, maybe? I could talk to the events coordinator tomorrow. We could do something in January, after the holidays. Invite everyone who matters." And there it was, the instant appropriation of my achievement, the need to turn it into a social event that reflected well on her, the mother of the successful daughter. Never mind that she'd spent the last decade telling her friends I was a late bloomer who just needed to find the right man to settle down with. That's really sweet, Mom, but I'm not much of a party person, you know that. Plus, I'm pretty busy right now. The company wants me to consult on the implementation phase, and I've got my teaching responsibilities at Rice. I watched her face fall slightly, that little flash of frustration when her children didn't perform according to script. My mother had raised us to be accessories to her social ambitions, and I'd been a consistently disappointing accessory for most of my adult life. Uncle Tom, bless him, was still grinning. "I've got to say, Richard, you must be bursting with pride. Your daughter's going to change the world with this technology. That's a hell of a legacy." He raised his glass toward my father, who managed a tight smile and raised his own glass in response. But I could see the muscle jumping in my father's jaw, could see the way his fingers gripped the stem of his wineglass just a little too hard. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. I wasn't supposed to succeed on this level without his help, without his guidance, without him being able to take partial credit. The rest of dinner was awkward, filled with stilted conversation and forced congratulations. My siblings kept looking at me like I'd suddenly grown a second head, and my parents kept exchanging glances that were having entire conversations I wasn't privy to. I played it cool, answering questions vaguely, deflecting attention, acting like the shy scientist who'd stumbled into success rather than the calculated strategist I'd become. They had no idea what was coming. They had no idea that the patent sale was just the opening move in a much longer game. After dinner, I helped clear the table, and my mother cornered me in the kitchen. The staff had been given the night off for the holiday, which meant it was just us and the dirty dishes. She loaded the dishwasher with practiced efficiency, her movements sharp and precise. "Lily, I need you to be honest with me. Is there something going on? Something you're not telling us?" Her voice was low, almost conspiratorial, and I recognized the tone. This was how she'd sounded when she'd asked me if I was doing drugs in high school because I'd been spending too much time in the science lab. This was how she'd sounded if she'd asked if I was gay because I hadn't brought a boyfriend home for Christmas 3 years running. "What do you mean, Mom? I just sold a patent, that's literally it. I've been working on this technology for years and it finally paid off. Isn't that what you always wanted? For me to be successful?" I kept my voice innocent, almost hurt, and watched her struggle with how to articulate what she really meant, which was something like, "Why didn't you tell us so we could control the narrative and claim credit for supporting you?" She dried her hands on a dish towel, her wedding ring catching the light. It was a massive diamond, 5 carats at least, that my father had given her on their 25th anniversary. "Of course I'm happy for you, sweetheart. I just wish you'd let us be part of your life more. Sometimes it feels like you keep us at arm's length, like you don't trust us." The irony of this statement was so profound I almost choked. They'd given me every reason not to trust them, from stolen intellectual property to minimized achievements to constant comparisons with my siblings. But I couldn't say that. Not yet. Not until all the pieces were in place. "I trust you, Mom. I just like to have my ducks in a row before I share news. You know how I am. I don't like counting my chickens before they hatch." I used all the folksy expressions she loved, the ones that made her feel like we were just simple people with good values, despite the fact that we were standing in a kitchen that cost more than most people's houses. She seemed to relax slightly, and I knew I'd said the right thing. My mother needed to believe that her children were simpler than they were, that our motivations were transparent and our loyalties unquestionable. We finished loading the dishwasher in silence, and then she hugged me, one of those brief, perfunctory hugs that society women give when they want to demonstrate affection without actually being vulnerable. "I'm proud of you, honey. Your father is too. He just doesn't always know how to show it." This was her standard line, the excuse she'd been making for him my entire life. "He's proud of you. He loves you. He just has a hard time expressing emotions." It was exhausting, this constant translation of his indifference into something that resembled parental care. I went home that night to my townhouse in Montrose, poured myself a bourbon, and sat on my balcony looking out at the Houston skyline. The air was cool for late November, and I could hear traffic on Westheimer, the constant hum of a city that never really sleeps. I thought about my family, sitting in that massive house in River Oaks, probably dissecting the evening's revelations, trying to figure out how this changed the family dynamics. I thought about my father, wondering if he was angry or impressed, or some complicated mixture of both. Mostly, I thought about the file folder I had locked in my safe, the one filled with documentation that was going to blow their carefully constructed world apart. Because here's what Uncle Tom didn't know, what none of them knew. The patent sale wasn't my biggest secret. It was just the preview, the attention getter, the thing that would make them finally see me as someone worth taking seriously. The real story, the one I'd been investigating for almost 2 years, was so much bigger and so much darker that when it came out, it would destroy the Whitmore family reputation permanently. And I was going to be the one to detonate that bomb, carefully and methodically and with perfect timing. It started with a question I'd asked myself after my father stole my undergraduate thesis. If he'd do that to his own daughter, what else was he capable of? So I started digging, quietly, carefully, using connections I'd made through my academic work and friendships I'd cultivated with people who had access to information. What I found was a pattern of behavior that went back decades, a systematic exploitation of other people's work that my father had built his entire consulting career on. He was a parasite, essentially, someone who attached himself to brilliant people, convinced them to share their ideas under the guise of mentorship or partnership, and then took credit for their innovations while cutting them out of the profits. I'd documented at least 7 instances over the past 20 years where he'd done this. 7 people whose careers he'd damaged or destroyed while enriching himself. Some of them had tried to fight back, but my father was well-connected and ruthless, and he'd buried their complaints under lawsuits and NDAs and social pressure. One of them, a young engineer named Thomas Chen, had committed suicide 5 years ago after my father had stolen his designs for an oil rig safety system and then destroyed his professional reputation when he tried to speak up. I'd found Thomas's widow, heard her story, and decided that someone needed to hold Richard Whitmore accountable. But I couldn't just go public with accusations. My father had too many powerful friends, too much money, too much ability to spin narratives and destroy credibility. I needed to be beyond reproach, which meant I needed to be successful on my own terms first. I needed to be someone people would believe, someone with credibility and resources and standing. The patent sale had given me that. Now I was the brilliant daughter who'd made millions on her own merit, and when I started talking about my father's pattern of theft, people would listen. The next morning, I got a call from Vanessa. She never called me unless she wanted something, so I let it go to voicemail while I finished my coffee. When I finally listened to the message, her voice was syrupy sweet, the fake warmth she used when she was about to ask for a favor. Hey, Lily, it's me. So I've been thinking about your patent thing, and I'm just so proud of you. I was wondering if maybe we could have lunch this week? There's something I want to talk to you about. Call me back. Love you. I deleted the voicemail without calling her back. I knew exactly what she wanted. Money, probably for some investment opportunity Trevor had mentioned, or maybe just to help fund their lifestyle now that oil prices were down and his bonuses weren't what they used to be. Vanessa had always seen me as a resource to be exploited when convenient and ignored otherwise, and I was done playing that game. She'd find out soon enough that the new Lily, the one with money and power and a plan, wasn't going to be as easy to manipulate as the old one. My phone rang again an hour later. This time it was my father. I considered not answering, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hi, Dad." I kept my voice neutral, professionally pleasant. He cleared his throat, the way he did when he was about to make a speech. "Liliana, I wanted to follow up on our conversation last night about the patent money. I've been thinking, and I really do think you should let me introduce you to some people. There are investment opportunities you should know about, ways to grow that capital that your New York guys probably aren't showing you." Here it was, the move I'd been expecting. He wanted access to my money, wanted to position himself as the gateway to opportunities, wanted to insert himself into my financial life so he could maintain control, and probably skim profits along the way. It was textbook Richard Whitmore, and it might have worked if I hadn't spent the last 2 years learning exactly how he operated. That's really generous, Dad, but I'm happy with my current situation. The Goldman team has been great, and I'm comfortable with their strategy. There was a pause, and I could practically hear him recalculating. I see. Well, if you change your mind, the offer stands. I just want to make sure you're being smart with this money. It's easy to make mistakes when you're not used to managing significant wealth. The condescension was subtle but unmistakable, the implication that I was somehow naive about money because I'd spent my life in academia rather than business. Never mind that I'd been managing my own finances since graduate school, living below my means and investing carefully, building a foundation of financial independence specifically so I'd never have to depend on him. I appreciate the concern, Dad, really, but I've got this handled. I let a little edge creep into my voice, just enough to signal that I wasn't the same daughter who used to apologize for existing. He heard it, I could tell, because there was another pause and then a forced laugh. Of course you do. You've always been the smart one. I'm proud of you, Liliana. I hope you know that. It was the second time in 12 hours that someone in my family had told me they were proud of me, and both times it had felt like a lie, or at least like something they were saying because they thought they should, rather than because they meant it. After I hung up, I opened my laptop and pulled up the files I'd been compiling. Thomas Chen's widow, Patricia, had given me access to his emails and notes, documentation that showed clearly how my father had stolen his work. I'd also tracked down 3 other victims who were willing to talk, people whose careers had been damaged, but who'd never had the resources to fight back legally. Together, their stories painted a damning picture of systematic intellectual theft and professional sabotage. I'd taken everything to a lawyer, not one of the Texas guys who might have connections to my father, but a woman in Chicago who specialized in intellectual property fraud. She reviewed the materials and confirmed that I had a solid case, not just in civil court, but potentially criminal court as well. The plan was simple. I'd wait until after the holidays, let my family enjoy one last Christmas of blissful ignorance, and then, in January, I'd file a comprehensive legal complaint that would detail my father's pattern of theft and name him publicly as an intellectual property thief. I'd also give exclusive interviews to the Houston Chronicle and Texas Monthly, publications that loved nothing more than a story about wealthy Houston families with dark secrets. The combination of legal action and public exposure would destroy his reputation permanently, and by extension, it would shatter the carefully constructed image of success and respectability that my family had built their entire identity around. Was I being vindictive? Absolutely. Was I being ruthless? Without question. But I'd learned from the best. My father had taught me that in the world of wealth and power, you either dominate or get dominated, and I was done being on the losing side of that equation. Thomas Chen deserved justice. The other people my father had hurt deserved justice. And maybe, in some small way, the 19-year-old version of me who'd believed her father when he said he was just proud of her thesis deserved justice too. I spent the next few weeks in a strange state of anticipation, like waiting for a storm you know is coming but can't quite see yet. My family kept calling, kept trying to insert themselves into my new success. Vanessa wanted to have lunch to catch up, which I finally agreed to just to see what she'd say. We met at a trendy restaurant in Highland Village, and she spent the first 20 minutes talking about her life, her kids, her husband's work, the renovation she was planning for their pool house. Then, finally, she got to the point. So, Lily, I was thinking, now that you've got all this money, maybe you'd want to invest in something more personal? Trevor's been looking at this amazing opportunity in medical office real estate, and they're looking for investors. It's a ground floor thing, really exclusive. I immediately thought of you. I sipped my iced tea and looked at her, this woman I'd grown up with, shared a room with for 12 years, and realized I didn't like her very much. She wasn't a bad person, exactly, just completely self-absorbed, utterly lacking in self-awareness, and seemingly incapable of seeing me as anything other than a means to an end. That's really thoughtful, Vanessa, but I'm not looking for investment opportunities right now. I'm focused on the foundation work I mentioned. Her face fell slightly, and I could see her mentally shifting tactics. Right, the foundation. That's so great, so charitable. But you have to take care of yourself, too. Make sure you're building wealth, not just giving it away. I just worry about you sometimes, Lily. You're so smart, but sometimes not practical about money. This from a woman who'd never earned a dollar in her life, who spent $30,000 a year on clothes and considered it a budget. I smiled sweetly. I appreciate the concern, Vanessa, but I'm good. Really good. Probably better than I've ever been. Something in my tone made her pause, made her look at me with slightly narrowed eyes, like she was seeing me clearly for the first time. "You've changed," she said finally. "You're different since the patent thing." I shrugged. Maybe I just finally figured out who I am and what I'm worth. Better late than never, right? Christmas came and went in the usual blur of expensive presents and forced cheer. My parents hosted the family at their house, and I showed up with wine and a smile and watched them all perform their assigned roles in the Whitmore Family Theater. My father played the patriarch, holding court about business and politics. My mother played the gracious hostess, ensuring everyone was comfortable and well-fed. Vanessa played the perfect daughter with the perfect family. James played the successful son with the successful career. And I played the part I'd been playing for months now, the quiet scientist who'd stumbled into good fortune and was just happy to be included. But underneath my performance, I was counting down the days until I could stop pretending. On New Year's Eve, I stayed home alone, which was exactly how I wanted it. I opened a bottle of champagne at midnight and toasted the empty room. Toasted the year that was about to begin. The year when I'd finally stop being invisible in my own family story. My lawyer had already drafted the complaint. The journalists had already agreed to run the stories pending legal review. The victims were ready to go public. Everything was aligned, and all I had to do was pull the trigger. But something was holding me back. Some last vestige of loyalty or fear or doubt that I couldn't quite shake. I thought about Thomas Chen, about the widow he'd left behind, about the fact that my father's theft had contributed to a man's death, and my father had never shown a moment of remorse. I thought about all the times my family had made me feel small and insignificant, all the achievements they'd minimized, all the ways they'd told me through word and deed that I didn't matter as much as my siblings. And I thought about the person I'd become, this harder, more calculating version of myself, and wondered if that was who I really was, or just who I'd needed to become to survive, in a family that valued winning above everything else. Then I poured another glass of champagne and made a decision. I was going through with it. All of it. And I was going to sleep just fine afterward. Because sometimes justice requires you to be willing to burn everything down and start over. My family had taught me that the only thing that mattered was power, and I'd learned the lesson almost too well. But now it was time to show them exactly what I was capable of when I finally decided to stop playing nice and start playing to win. And something told me they weren't going to like discovering that the quiet daughter they'd ignored for so long had been paying attention all along, learning their tricks, studying their weaknesses, and preparing for the moment when she'd finally have enough leverage to make them understand what it felt like to be on the receiving end of their casual cruelty and systematic exploitation. The complaint was filed on January 8th, a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon, my phone was exploding. I'd turned off notifications, but I could still see the screen lighting up every few seconds with calls from my parents, from Vanessa, from James, from numbers I didn't recognize that were probably reporters or family friends or angry business associates of my father's. I ignored all of them and went to teach my 10 o'clock class at Rice, lecturing on polymer chemistry to 30 undergraduates who had no idea that their professor had just initiated the legal destruction of one of Houston's prominent families. It felt surreal and perfect, standing there talking about molecular structures while my phone vibrated silently in my bag with increasingly frantic messages. The Houston Chronicle ran their story that evening, front page of the business section. Prominent consultant accused of systematic IP theft. They'd done their homework, interviewing not just me, but also Patricia Chen and two of the other victims who were willing to go on record. The article was devastating, laying out a pattern of behavior that spanned 2 decades and included enough specific details to make it impossible to dismiss as sour grapes from failed competitors. Texas Monthly's longer piece would run in their February issue, but they'd published a preview online that afternoon, and by evening the story was trending on Houston Twitter and LinkedIn. I finally listened to my voicemails around 8 that night. My father's voice was shaking with rage. "How dare you? How dare you betray your own family like this? Everything I've done has been for you, for your mother, for your siblings. And this is how you repay me? With lies and public humiliation? You're going to regret this, Liliana. You don't know what you've started." My mother's message was more emotional, her voice breaking. "Lily, please call me, please. I don't understand what's happening. Why would you do this? We need to talk as a family. This is all just a misunderstanding. Please come home so we can fix this." Vanessa's message was pure venom. "You spiteful witch! You've always been jealous of me, of James, of anyone who actually made something of themselves without hiding in a laboratory like some kind of hermit. Now you've destroyed Dad's reputation just to make yourself feel important. I hope you're happy. I hope that patent money was worth losing your family over." James didn't leave a voicemail, but he sent a text. "We need to talk. This affects all of us, not just Dad. Call me." I deleted everything and blocked their numbers. I'd said what I needed to say through my lawyer and through the press. There was nothing they could tell me now that would change anything. The next few days were chaos. My father's consulting firm released a statement denying all allegations and threatening countersuits for defamation. His lawyer, a bulldog named Frank Garrison, who specialized in defending wealthy men accused of bad behavior, held a press conference calling me a disgruntled daughter seeking attention and money. Several of my father's business associates published statements of support, saying they'd worked with him for years and found him to be ethical and honest. It was exactly the playbook I'd expected. Deny everything, attack the accuser's credibility, circle the wagons, and hope it all blows over. What they hadn't counted on was how thoroughly I'd documented everything and how many people were willing to corroborate the pattern. By the end of the week, 3 more victims had come forward, people I hadn't even known about who'd read the Chronicle article and recognized the same pattern in their own experiences with my father. One of them was a woman named Dr. Sarah Martinez, who'd worked with him on a renewable energy project 10 years ago. She'd developed a novel approach to solar panel efficiency, shared it with my father, who was supposed to be consulting on commercialization strategy, and then watched him present her work as his own to investors while cutting her out of the deal entirely. She'd been too afraid to speak up at the time because she was a young Latina scientist in a field dominated by white men, and she knew she wouldn't be believed. But now, with multiple people making similar accusations, she felt safe enough to add her voice. The Foundation for Intellectual Property Rights, a national organization I'd connected with through my lawyer, announced they were opening a formal investigation into my father's business practices. This was huge, because it meant the story was no longer just local Texas drama, but a case study in intellectual property theft that would have implications for how consultants and advisors operated across the country. Suddenly, my father wasn't just fighting to save his reputation in Houston, he was fighting to stay out of prison because the FBI had apparently started looking into whether his actions constituted wire fraud. My mother showed up at my townhouse on Saturday morning. I'd been expecting this, some kind of personal appeal, and I'd debated whether to let her in. In the end, I decided to hear her out, partly because I was curious what she'd say, and partly because I wanted her to see my face when I told her I wasn't backing down. She looked terrible, her makeup not quite concealing the fact that she'd been crying, her clothes still expensive and perfectly coordinated, but somehow hanging on her frame like she'd lost weight in the past week. "Can I come in?" she asked, and I stepped aside to let her pass. We sat in my small living room, and she looked around at my modest furniture, my bookshelves crammed with textbooks and journals, my life that was so different from the one she'd imagined for me. "I don't understand," she said finally. "I've been going over and over it in my mind, and I just don't understand why you do this. If you had concerns about your father's business practices, you could have come to us privately. We could have discussed it as a family. Instead, you went nuclear. You destroyed him publicly. And for what? Revenge? Money? What did you think this would accomplish?" I looked at her, this woman who'd raised me and loved me in her limited way, and yet had never really seen me. "It wasn't about revenge, Mom. Or maybe it was partly about revenge, I'm not going to lie about that, but mostly it was about accountability. Dad has been stealing other people's work for decades. He ruined careers. He damaged lives. One of his victims killed himself. And nobody ever stopped him because he had money and connections, and people like you who looked the other way and made excuses. Someone had to hold him accountable, and it turned out that someone was going to be me." She shook her head, tears sliding down her cheeks. "That's not fair. I didn't know about any of that. Your father never told me about his business dealings in detail. I trusted him." This was probably true, I realized. My mother had been so focused on maintaining social status and managing family image that she'd never looked too closely at how my father actually made his money. She'd been willfully ignorant, which wasn't quite the same as complicit, but wasn't innocent either. "You could have asked," I said quietly. "You could have wondered why he was so successful without ever seeming to do original work. You could have questioned where all the money came from, but you didn't because you didn't want to know. And that's on you, Mom." She stood up abruptly, her face flushing. "Don't you dare put this on me. I'm not the one who betrayed my family. I'm not the one who aired private matters in public. You've humiliated all of us, Lily. Do you understand that? Your sister can't show her face at the club. Your brother is losing clients because they don't want to be associated with the Whitmore name. And your father might go to jail. Jail! Is that what you wanted? To see your own father in prison?" Her voice had risen to almost a shout, and I could see the rage beneath her hurt, the anger at me for breaking the unspoken rule that you protect family no matter what they've done. "If he goes to jail, it'll be because he committed crimes, not because I reported them," I said, keeping my voice level. "And yeah, I understand that this affects all of you. That's unfortunate. But Thomas Chen's family was affected when he killed himself. Dr. Martinez's career was affected when Dad stole her work. All those other people Dad hurt over the years were affected. So forgive me if I don't feel too bad that Vanessa can't go to the country club without people talking about her." I stood up too, facing her. "You taught me that family comes first, that we protect each other no matter what. But you never taught me that family means enabling criminal behavior and covering up abuse. I'm sorry you're caught in the fallout, Mom. I really am. But I'm not sorry for what I did." She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to reconcile the daughter she thought she knew with the person standing in front of her. Finally, she said, "You've changed. You're not the girl I raised." I nodded. "You're right. I'm not. That girl would have kept quiet and let Dad keep hurting people because she was more afraid of conflict than injustice. This version of me decided that doing the right thing matters more than keeping the peace." My mother walked to the door, then turned back. "When this all falls apart for you, when you realize what you've lost, don't come crying to us. You made your choice. Now live with it." She left, without saying goodbye, and I locked the door behind her and felt nothing except a strange sense of relief. The story continued to develop over the next few weeks. My father's firm lost 3 major clients, and 2 of his partners resigned, citing ethical concerns. Frank Garrison tried to muddy the waters with counter-accusations, suggesting I'd stolen the patent technology from my father's files, but that fell apart quickly when my lawyer produced documentation showing I'd been working on the filtration system since before I'd even joined the faculty at Rice, using my own resources and my own research. The Foundation for Intellectual Property Rights published a preliminary report finding credible evidence of systematic misconduct, and the FBI formally opened an investigation into possible wire fraud and tax evasion related to improperly claimed intellectual property. But the most satisfying development came from an unexpected source. A professor at MIT named Dr. James Okafor reached out to me through my lawyer. Turns out he'd been my father's graduate advisor 30 years ago, and he'd always suspected that my father's dissertation had incorporated work from other students without proper attribution. He'd never been able to prove it at the time, but now, with the current allegations providing context, he'd gone back through his old files and found documentation showing that my father had essentially plagiarized large portions of his thesis. This was huge because it meant my father's PhD was potentially fraudulent, which would invalidate basically his entire career and professional credentials. Dr. Okafor submitted his findings to MIT's Research Integrity Office, and they announced they were reviewing the matter. I kept teaching, kept working, kept living my life while my family's world imploded. It was easier than I'd expected, partly because I'd done all my processing of guilt and doubt before I'd filed the complaint, and partly because the more information that came out, the more convinced I became that I'd done exactly the right thing. My father wasn't just a thief, he was a serial thief, someone who'd built an entire career on exploiting other people's talent and hard work. He deserved everything that was happening to him, and if my family couldn't see that, if they'd rather maintain their comfortable denial than face reality, that was their problem, not mine. In early February, I got a call from Patricia Chen. She'd been following the case closely, and she wanted to meet in person. We had coffee at a place near her house in Pearland, and she cried when she thanked me. "You gave Thomas justice," she said. "You did what I couldn't do. What none of us could do alone. You made people see the truth about your father." I held her hand across the table and felt the weight of what I'd done settle into something that felt almost like peace. This wasn't about my family anymore. It wasn't even about me. It was about all the people my father had hurt and making sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. She asked me something that surprised me. "Do you miss them? Your family?" I thought about it. Really thought about it. Did I miss the dinners where I felt invisible? Did I miss the constant comparisons to my siblings? Did I miss my father's manipulation and my mother's superficiality and my sister's condescension? "No," I said finally. "I don't miss them. I miss the family I thought I had, the one I wanted them to be. But that family never really existed. It was just a fantasy I'd been holding on to, and now I've let it go." The foundation I'd mentioned at Thanksgiving became real. I hired a small staff, rented office space in the Med Center area, and started working with communities in South Texas to implement clean water solutions. The work was challenging and meaningful, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was using my skills for something that mattered beyond just academic achievement or professional success. We helped install filtration systems in 3 colonias along the border, providing clean drinking water to families who'd been relying on contaminated wells for generations. When I visited those communities and saw kids drinking clean water, saw parents crying with relief that their children wouldn't get sick anymore, I knew I'd made the right choices. The legal case against my father dragged on, because rich people can afford to delay justice almost indefinitely, but the court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict. He was toxic now, radioactive in Houston business circles, and even his most loyal friends had quietly distanced themselves. His firm went bankrupt in March, and he and my mother had to sell the River Oaks house to pay legal fees. They moved to a condo in the Galleria area, still nice by normal standards, but a huge step down from their previous lifestyle. Vanessa stopped posting on social media entirely, and James relocated to Dallas, apparently deciding that geography might help him escape the family scandal. I ran into my father once, completely by accident, in late April. I was picking up supplies at a hardware store near the med center, and he was there with my mother, looking at paint samples. He'd aged dramatically in the past few months, his hair more gray, his face thinner, his whole bearing diminished. We made eye contact across the aisle, and for a moment I thought he might try to talk to me, might try one last time to make me feel guilty or afraid. Instead, he just looked at me with something that might have been sadness or might have been resignation, and then he turned away. My mother didn't even look at me. They checked out and left, and I finished my shopping and went home. And I realized that they were just people now, not the looming figures of authority they'd been for most of my life. The FBI investigation concluded in June with an indictment on 3 counts of wire fraud. My father's lawyer negotiated a plea deal: 2 years in federal prison and restitution to victims, which was less than he deserved but more than I'd honestly expected him to get. White-collar criminals, especially wealthy white men, rarely faced serious consequences, but at least this was something. At least there was an acknowledgement that what he'd done was criminal, not just unethical. Patricia Chen was listed as one of the victims entitled to restitution, and when she received her check, she called me crying again, thanking me again, and I realized that this was what justice felt like when it actually worked. MIT revoked my father's PhD in August after their investigation confirmed that his dissertation had incorporated plagiarized material. This meant that every credential he'd ever claimed, every achievement he'd ever cited, was built on a foundation of lies. The local news covered it as a footnote to the larger scandal, but to me, it felt like the final piece clicking into place. My father had positioned himself as an expert, as someone with academic credentials and intellectual authority, and it had all been fake. He was a fraud in every sense of the word, and now everyone knew it. I was having lunch with Uncle Tom in September when he told me something that made everything even more complicated and somehow more satisfying. He'd been doing some research of his own, looking into the family history, and he'd discovered something interesting about my trust fund. Apparently, my grandfather, my father's father, had set up trusts for all his grandchildren with very specific instructions. The money was supposed to be distributed when we turned 30, but there was a clause that said if any grandchild demonstrated exceptional ethical character and professional achievement, they could receive an additional distribution from a special reserve fund. My father had been the executor of these trusts, and he'd never mentioned this provision to any of us. Uncle Tom, who was also a beneficiary of my grandfather's estate and had access to the trust documents, had realized that I qualified for the additional distribution. In fact, I'd qualified several years ago based on my academic achievements and research work, but my father had never processed the paperwork. After doing some digging, Uncle Tom discovered that my father had actually embezzled money from this reserve fund, using it for his own business expenses and gambling debts. This was separate from the intellectual property theft, a whole other crime that had gone undetected for years. The amount was substantial, nearly $2 million that should have been distributed to me and my siblings, but had instead been stolen by my father. Uncle Tom had already reported this to the authorities and to the other trust beneficiaries. He was furious, not just on my behalf, but on principle. Your grandfather specifically set up that reserve fund to reward his grandchildren for being good people, he said. He would be devastated to know that his own son had stolen from his grandchildren. I'm so sorry, Lily. I should have been paying closer attention to the trust administration. I assured him it wasn't his fault, that my father was skilled at deception and had fooled a lot of people who should have known better. But internally, I was processing this new information, adding it to the mountain of evidence that my father was even worse than I'd thought. The trust fund revelation led to additional charges and more restitution orders. My father's plea deal was modified to include these new crimes, and his prison sentence was extended to 4 years. My mother filed for divorce in October, finally reaching the limit of what she was willing to tolerate, or perhaps just realizing that the social cost of staying married to him was too high. Vanessa and James both reached out to me through Uncle Tom, not quite apologizing, but suggesting they'd been wrong about some things and maybe we could talk. I told Uncle Tom I'd think about it, but honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to rebuild those relationships. Some things, once broken, weren't worth fixing. The foundation continued to grow. By the end of the year, we'd helped 12 communities across Texas and had started working with partners in Guatemala and Honduras. The work was exhausting but rewarding, and I'd built a team of people who actually cared about making a difference rather than just advancing their careers. I still taught at Rice, still did my research, but the foundation had become my primary focus. It felt right, using my success to help people who needed it, creating something positive out of the wreckage of my family's corruption. I went home for Christmas, not to my parents' place because that wasn't home anymore, but to Uncle Tom's house, where he'd invited the extended family for the holiday. It was smaller than the Whitmore gatherings used to be, just Uncle Tom and his wife, a few cousins I actually liked, and, surprisingly, Vanessa. She'd come alone, having left Trevor and the kids with his family, and she looked different. Less polished, less certain, more human somehow. We didn't talk much at first, just exchanged pleasantries and navigated around each other carefully, but after dinner, she found me on the back porch where I'd gone to escape the crowd. "I need to say something," she started, and I braced myself for another attack, or a guilt trip, or whatever defensive mechanism she'd prepared. Instead, she surprised me. "You were right, about Dad, about all of it. I didn't want to believe it at first because it was easier to blame you than to face the truth about him. But I've spent the last year thinking about things, about how we were raised, about the values we were taught, and I realize now that none of it was real. It was all image and no substance, and you were the only one brave enough to call it out." Her voice was shaking slightly, and I could see this was genuinely hard for her. "I'm not asking you to forgive me or even to like me. I just wanted you to know that I see you now. I see what you did and why you did it, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." I didn't know what to say. This was so far from anything I'd expected from Vanessa that I was genuinely speechless. Finally, I managed, "Thank you. That means something hearing you say that." We stood there in awkward silence for a moment, and then she asked, "Do you think we can ever be sisters again? Like real sisters, not just people who share DNA?" I thought about it, honestly. I don't know. Maybe. But it would have to be different than before. I'm not interested in going back to the way things were, where I was invisible and you were the golden child. If we're going to have a relationship, it has to be as equals. She nodded. "I can do that. Or at least I want to try. I've been doing therapy, working through some stuff, and my therapist says I have a lot of internalized issues around worth and competition. Apparently, I've been defining myself through comparisons with other people, especially you, and it's been toxic. I'm trying to change that." This was more self-awareness than I'd ever heard from Vanessa, and I felt something soften in me slightly. Well, therapy is good. That's good that you're doing that work. We talked for a while longer, carefully, like two people learning a new language, and by the end of the conversation, I felt like maybe there was a possibility of something there. Not what we'd had before, but something new and potentially more honest. James reached out a few weeks later. His message was shorter, less emotionally articulate than Vanessa's had been, but it conveyed similar sentiments. He acknowledged that he'd been wrong to defend our father, admitted that he'd suspected something wasn't right with Dad's business practices, but had ignored his instincts because it was easier. He asked if we could meet for coffee when he was back in Houston, and I agreed, curious to see if he'd really changed or if this was just damage control. The coffee meeting was awkward, but not hostile. James had always been harder to read than Vanessa, more closed off emotionally, but I could see he was genuinely struggling with the revelation that our father was a criminal and our family legacy was built on lies. I keep thinking about all the times Dad talked about integrity and hard work, James said at one point. He'd give us these lectures about earning what you have, about the value of reputation, and the whole time he was stealing from people. How do you reconcile that? How do you square the person you thought he was with who he actually is? I didn't have a good answer for that because I'd been struggling with the same question. I think maybe he believed his own lies, I said finally, or maybe he justified it somehow, convinced himself that he was just more clever than other people and deserved to benefit from their ideas. People are really good at rationalizing their own bad behavior. James nodded slowly. I think I did the same thing. I knew something was off, but I told myself I was being paranoid or jealous or whatever. I made excuses because it was easier than confronting reality. He looked at me directly. You were the brave one, Lily. You were the only one willing to face the truth and do something about it, even when it cost you everything. I respect that, even though I wish the truth had been different. This was probably the most honest conversation I'd ever had with my brother, and I found myself softening toward him too, just a little. These weren't instant reconciliations. We weren't going to be close anytime soon, maybe ever, but there was potential for something, some kind of relationship built on truth rather than the elaborate fiction we'd all been living. My mother never reached out. I heard through Uncle Tom that she'd moved to Santa Fe after the divorce, trying to reinvent herself in a place where nobody knew the Whitmore scandal. She'd cut off all contact with my father and apparently spent her days taking art classes and going to wellness retreats and doing whatever wealthy divorcees do when they're trying to pretend they're spiritual rather than just running away from their problems. Part of me felt sad about that, about the fact that she couldn't face what had happened, couldn't acknowledge her role in enabling my father's behavior, but mostly I just felt indifferent. She'd made her choices, and I'd made mine, and we were living with the consequences. The foundation threw a party in February to celebrate our first year of operation. We'd helped 23 communities, installed filtration systems that served over 15,000 people, and trained local operators to maintain the equipment. The party was at a hotel in downtown Houston, and we'd invited donors, community partners, and some of the people my father had hurt who'd become advocates for intellectual property reform. It felt like a different kind of family, one based on shared values and mutual respect rather than blood and obligation. My Uncle Tom gave a toast that made me cry. He talked about integrity and courage, about the difference between success and significance, about how proud he was to be related to someone who'd chosen principle over comfort. Lily could have taken her patent money and lived a comfortable life, enjoying her success while ignoring her father's crimes, he said. Instead, she chose justice, she chose truth, and in doing so, she not only held a criminal accountable, but created something beautiful and life-changing for thousands of people. That's the kind of legacy that matters. That's the kind of person I want my own children to learn from. Everyone clapped, and I stood there feeling overwhelmed with emotion, realizing that I'd finally found what I'd been looking for my whole life, a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to my family's approval or society's expectations. My father's sentencing hearing was in March. I attended, sitting in the courtroom gallery with Patricia Chen and Dr. Martinez and several other victims. My father looked small in his suit, diminished and defeated, and when the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he stood and read from a prepared statement that his lawyer had clearly written. It was all boilerplate remorse, expressing regret for his actions and apologizing to the people he'd hurt. But there was no real emotion behind it, no genuine understanding of the harm he'd caused. When he mentioned his family, how he'd let us down and wished he could make amends, I felt nothing except a kind of cold satisfaction that he was finally facing consequences. The judge sentenced him to 4 years in federal prison, which meant he'd probably serve about 3 with good behavior. It wasn't enough, not really, but it was something. After the hearing, reporters caught me outside the courthouse, asking how I felt about my father's sentence. I kept my answer brief. I'm glad that justice was served, and I hope this case sends a message that intellectual property theft is a serious crime with real consequences. My focus now is on the foundation and helping communities that need clean water. That's where I'm putting my energy. I didn't mention my father by name. I didn't give them any emotional sound bites about family betrayal or personal vindication. I just stated facts and walked away. Life settled into a new normal over the next few months. I found a rhythm between teaching, running the foundation, and maintaining the relationships I wanted to keep. Vanessa and I had coffee about once a month, slowly building something that resembled a sisterly relationship. James and I texted occasionally, mainly about practical matters, but sometimes about more personal things. Uncle Tom became a kind of surrogate father figure, someone I could talk to about decisions and challenges without worrying about judgment or manipulation. I started dating someone, a civil engineer I'd met through foundation work, and for the first time in my life, I was in a relationship with someone who knew the real me, the complicated, sometimes ruthless, always principled version, and liked me anyway. The foundation continued to grow. We expanded into sub-Saharan Africa, partnering with local organizations to bring clean water technology to villages that had never had reliable access. The work was hard, requiring constant fundraising and advocacy and problem solving, but it was the most meaningful thing I'd ever done. Every time I saw a community celebrate their new filtration system, every time I heard from a mother whose child was healthier because they had clean water, I felt validated in my choices. This was what success looked like when it was built on truth rather than lies, when it helped people rather than exploiting them. I thought sometimes about the 19-year-old version of myself, the one who'd believed her father when he said he was proud of her thesis, who'd trusted that family meant protection and support. That girl would be shocked by who I'd become, by the choices I'd made, by the willingness to burn everything down for the sake of justice. But I thought she'd also be proud, once she understood what I'd learned. That real strength isn't about keeping the peace at any cost. It's about having the courage to speak truth even when it costs you everything you thought mattered. That real family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about mutual respect and shared values. That real success isn't about wealth or status. It's about using your gifts to make the world better than you found it. On the anniversary of that Thanksgiving dinner, exactly 1 year after Uncle Tom had asked about the patent sale and set everything in motion, I hosted a small gathering at my townhouse. Not my blood family, but the family I'd chosen. Uncle Tom and his wife, Patricia Chen, Dr. Martinez, a few colleagues from Rice, my boyfriend, and the core staff from the foundation. We ate and laughed and told stories, and at one point, someone asked me if I ever regretted what I'd done, if I ever wished I'd handled things differently. I thought about it for a moment, really considered the question honestly. Did I regret destroying my relationship with my parents and siblings? Did I regret the pain and chaos of the past year? Did I regret choosing justice over family loyalty?
No, I said finally. I don't regret it. I regret that my father's crimes made it necessary. I regret that my family couldn't or wouldn't hold him accountable themselves. I regret that Thomas Chen and all those other people were hurt in the first place. But the choice I made to speak up and take action? No, I don't regret that at all, because the alternative was to stay silent and complicit, and I couldn't live with that. I'd rather have the life I have now, with its complications and challenges, than the life I would have had if I'd looked the other way. Some things matter more than comfort, and integrity is one of them. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and I was cleaning up, I found myself thinking about the girl in the laboratory, the one who'd spent years developing technology in secret because she'd learned early that her family couldn't be trusted with her success. I thought about how lonely that must have been, how careful and calculated and defensive, and I realized that I didn't have to be that person anymore. I'd done the hard thing, faced the consequences, and come out the other side with a life that was messier but more authentic, smaller in some ways, but richer in the ways that mattered. I'd lost a family, but I'd gained myself, and that trade was worth it 1,000 times over. The foundation work took me to a village in Kenya that summer, and I spent a week helping install filtration systems and training local operators. On the last day, a woman named Amina pulled me aside and gave me a hand-woven bracelet her daughter had made. "Thank you for seeing us," she said through a translator. "Thank you for believing we deserved clean water." I wore that bracelet every day after, a reminder of why I'd done what I'd done, why justice and truth and integrity mattered more than maintaining comfortable lies. Because every person deserves to be seen, to be valued, to have their contributions recognized. And sometimes the only way to make that happen is to refuse to participate in systems that exploit and diminish and steal, even when those systems are your own family. I ran into my sister at the grocery store in September. We hadn't seen each other in several months, though we'd been texting regularly. She looked good, lighter somehow, like she'd shed some weight that wasn't physical. We got coffee afterward, and she told me about the changes she'd been making in her life. She'd gone back to school, was working toward a degree in social work. She'd left Trevor after realizing their marriage had been more about appearances than actual partnership. She was learning to define herself by her own values rather than other people's expectations. "You inspired me," she said. "Watching you blow up your life for the sake of doing the right thing, it made me realize I'd been living wrong, prioritizing all the wrong things. I'm still figuring it out, but I'm trying to be better." We talked about our father sometimes, Vanessa and James and I, in the careful way people discuss shared trauma they're still processing. He'd be released from prison eventually, would try to rebuild some kind of life, and we'd all have to decide what role, if any, we wanted him to play in our futures. I'd already decided that my answer was none, that I'd done my duty by holding him accountable, and now I was free to move forward without him. Vanessa was less certain, struggling with the pull of filial obligation and the reality of who he'd proven himself to be. James was somewhere in the middle, angry still, but also sad about the loss of the father he'd thought he had. We were all grieving, in our own ways, for the family we'd never actually been, but had always wanted to believe we were.
The lawsuit settlements finally came through in November. Substantial payments to all the victims who'd been willing to come forward and be identified. Patricia Chen used her money to establish a scholarship fund in her husband's name for engineering students. Dr. Martinez donated hers to organizations supporting women in STEM. I put mine into the foundation's endowment, ensuring we'd have stable funding for years to come. It felt appropriate, using money that had been stolen to fund work that was helping people, turning something corrupt into something clean. Justice wasn't just about punishment, I'd learned. It was also about restoration, about trying to make things right even when they could never be completely whole again. Christmas that year was quiet.
I spent it with Uncle Tom's family and my boyfriend, exchanging modest gifts and eating too much food and enjoying the absence of performance and pretension. No one was trying to impress anyone. No one was competing for attention or approval. It was just people who genuinely cared about each other, spending time together because they wanted to, not because obligation or tradition demanded it. This was what family should be, I thought. Not perfect, not without complications, but honest and supportive and real. Later, as I drove home through Houston's dark streets, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: contentment. Not happiness, exactly, because that seemed too simple for the complexity of what I'd been through, but a deep sense of rightness about my life and my choices. The foundation celebrated its second anniversary in February with a report documenting our impact. We'd helped 57 communities across 3 continents, served over 40,000 people, and trained hundreds of local operators. We'd also become advocates for intellectual property reform, working with the legislators to strengthen protections for inventors and researchers and close loopholes that enabled theft. Patricia Chen had become a board member and spokesperson, sharing her husband's story and calling for systemic change. What had started as my personal quest for justice had evolved into something bigger, a movement to protect vulnerable creators and ensure that innovation benefited the people who actually did the work. I got a letter from my father in March. It had been forwarded through my lawyer, respecting the no-contact order I'd obtained. The lawyer included a note asking if I wanted to read it or have it destroyed unopened. I thought about it for a week before deciding to read it, curious despite myself about what he might say. The letter was handwritten, which surprised me, and it was shorter than I expected. He didn't apologize, not really, though he used words like regret and remorse. He didn't take full responsibility, still making excuses about business pressures and competitive environments. But at the end, he wrote something that felt almost genuine. "You were always the strongest of my children, Liliana. I see that now. I wish I had seen it sooner. I wish I had encouraged it instead of fearing it. You deserved better than the father I was." I read the letter 3 times, looking for manipulation or a hidden agenda, but I couldn't find one. Maybe he meant it. Maybe prison had given him space for genuine reflection. Or maybe it was just another performance, carefully calculated to seem sincere. I'd never know for certain, and I realized I didn't need to. His intentions didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I'd chosen truth over comfort, justice over loyalty, integrity over family. What mattered was that I'd used my anger and hurt to create something meaningful, to help people who needed it, to build a life I was genuinely proud of. He couldn't take that away from me, no matter what he wrote in a letter from prison. I didn't respond to the letter. I filed it away in a folder with all the other documentation from the case, part of the historical record, but not part of my present or future. My lawyer asked if I wanted to maintain the no-contact order, and I said yes. Maybe someday I'd feel differently, but right now I needed the boundary. I needed the space to continue building my life without his presence, even in the form of occasional letters. Some relationships are too damaged to salvage, and that's okay. You can acknowledge the loss without spending your life trying to fix something that was never really whole to begin with. The foundation hired its 20th employee that spring, a young engineer from El Paso who'd grown up in one of the communities we'd helped. She told me at her interview that our work had inspired her to study environmental engineering, that seeing the filtration system in her neighborhood had made her realize technology could change lives. Hiring her felt like closing a circle somehow, like proof that what we were doing had impact beyond just clean water, that we were creating opportunities and hope and possibility. This was the legacy I wanted to leave. Not wealth or status or a family name, but tangible change in the world. I thought about that Thanksgiving dinner sometimes, about Uncle Tom's seemingly innocent question and my family's stunned reactions. It felt like a lifetime ago now, though it had only been 18 months. I'd been so nervous that night, knowing what was coming but not sure I had the courage to follow through. I'd spent years planning and preparing, but in the moment, sitting at that table with wine in my hand and my family's eyes on me, I'd almost lost my nerve. What if I was wrong? What if they turned out to be right, and I was just a vindictive daughter with an axe to grind? What if speaking up destroyed everything and left me with nothing? But I'd done it anyway, and the world hadn't ended. In fact, it had gotten better, clearer, more aligned with my values. The fear had been real, but it had also been wrong. Speaking truth didn't destroy everything, it just destroyed the lies, and what remained was more solid, more real, more worth keeping. Vanessa called me in May to tell me she'd gotten engaged to someone new, a social worker she'd met through her graduate program. "He's nothing like Trevor," she said, laughing. "He doesn't care about country clubs or the right neighborhood or any of that stuff. He cares about helping people and making the world better. You'd actually like him, Lily. I think you two would get along." I felt genuinely happy for her, this sister who'd spent so much of our lives competing with me and whom I'd resented so intensely. She was becoming someone different, someone more authentic, and I liked this version of her. We weren't close, not the way sisters in movies are close, but we were building something real, and that felt like a small miracle. James started his own firm that summer, a much smaller operation than his previous hedge fund partnership, focused on ethical investing and impact funds. He called to tell me about it, nervous about how I'd react. "I know it doesn't make up for anything," he said. "I know I can't undo the years of being complicit with Dad's worldview, but I'm trying to do better, to be better. Your example showed me that you can be successful without compromising your principles." I told him I was proud of him, and I meant it. Change is hard, especially when it requires admitting you've been wrong about fundamental things. The fact that both my siblings were making genuine efforts to become better people felt like an unexpected gift, something I hadn't anticipated when I'd filed that first complaint. The three of us had dinner together in June, just us, no partners or extended family. It was strange, but not uncomfortable, like we were learning to be siblings as adults rather than the children we'd been. We didn't talk about our father much, but we talked about our mother, about whether we should reach out to her, invite her back into our lives. None of us were quite ready for that, but we acknowledged that maybe someday we would be. Families are complicated, we agreed. You can love people and still hold them accountable. You can maintain boundaries while leaving the door open for future reconciliation. Nothing has to be permanent, and nothing has to be perfect. You just have to be honest about where you are and what you need. The foundation won an award that fall, recognition from an international development organization for innovation in water technology deployment. I gave a speech at the ceremony, talking about the importance of intellectual property rights and ethical practices in technology development. I talked about Thomas Chen and the others who'd been victims of IP theft, about how innovation requires trust and collaboration, and how that trust is destroyed when people steal ideas for personal gain. I talked about accountability and justice, and the responsibility we all have to stand up against wrongdoing, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs us personally. Standing there in front of hundreds of people, I felt proud of what I'd built, not just the foundation, but also myself, this version of me that had emerged from the wreckage of my family. My boyfriend proposed that winter, and I said yes. Not because I needed marriage to feel complete, but because I genuinely wanted to build a life with someone who saw me clearly and loved me anyway, complicated edges and all. We planned a small wedding for the spring, just close friends and the family I'd chosen, people who'd supported me through the hardest decisions of my life. Vanessa would be there, and James, and Uncle Tom would walk me down the aisle, since my father was still in prison and wouldn't be invited even if he weren't. My mother would get an invitation, but I wasn't sure if she'd come. Either way was fine. The wedding was for me and my future husband, not for anyone else. I visited Patricia Chen one last time before the wedding, wanting to share the news with someone who'd been there from the beginning. We sat in her kitchen drinking tea, and she held my hand across the table. "Thomas would be so proud of you," she said. "Not just for holding your father accountable, but for everything you've built since then, for taking something painful and creating something beautiful. That's the best revenge, you know, living well, doing good work, being genuinely happy. That's how you win." I thanked her for trusting me, for being brave enough to share her story, for helping me understand that justice matters even when it's hard. We both cried a little, grief and gratitude all mixed together, and then we talked about happier things, about my wedding plans and her grandchildren, and the future we were both still building. The wedding was perfect in its imperfection. My sister helped me get ready, fixing my hair when I couldn't get it right, and making me laugh when I got nervous. My brother walked me halfway down the aisle, then Uncle Tom took over for the final approach, both of them representing the family I'd lost and the family I'd found. My colleagues from the foundation were there, and the friends I'd made through years of work and struggle. Patricia Chen was there, and Dr. Martinez, and several of the other people whose lives had intersected with mine through this strange journey. When I said my vows, promising honesty and partnership and mutual respect, I meant every word, because I learned through painful experience exactly how valuable those things were, and how rare. At the reception, Uncle Tom gave another toast, this one about resilience and courage, and the power of choosing principle over comfort. "Lily has taught all of us what real strength looks like," he said. "Not the kind that dominates or controls, but the kind that stands firm when it would be easier to bend, the kind that speaks truth when silence would be safer, the kind that builds something beautiful out of something broken. We're all better for knowing her, and I'm honored to be part of her chosen family." Everyone raised their glasses, and I looked around at these people who'd shown up for me, who'd supported me, who'd helped me become someone I was proud to be. This was what winning looked like, I thought. Not the patent money or the foundation's success, or even the satisfaction of seeing my father face justice, though all those things mattered. Winning was this: people you love, work that matters, and the clear conscience that comes from living according to your values. I got pregnant that fall, unplanned but not unwelcome, and spent the next 9 months adjusting to the idea of bringing a child into the world. It terrified me, honestly, the thought of being someone's mother after having such a complicated relationship with my own mother. What if I repeated her mistakes? What if I prioritized the wrong things, demanded too much, gave too little? My husband was patient with my anxiety, reminding me that awareness was half the battle, that the fact that I was worried about being a good parent probably meant I would be. Vanessa, surprisingly, was also helpful, sharing her own struggles with motherhood and being refreshingly honest about how hard it was and how imperfectly she'd handled things. My daughter was born in May, a perfect spring baby with dark eyes and my husband's smile. I named her Amina Chen, honoring both the woman in Kenya who'd thanked me for seeing her and Thomas Chen, who'd deserved so much better than what my father had given him. It felt right, using my daughter's name to acknowledge the people who'd shaped my understanding of justice and responsibility. My siblings came to the hospital to meet her, and Uncle Tom and Patricia Chen, who cried again and said it was a beautiful name, a beautiful tribute. My mother sent a gift but didn't come, still maintaining her distance, still unable or unwilling to bridge the gap that had opened between us. Holding my daughter for the first time, I made silent promises about the kind of parent I'd try to be, the kind of values I'd try to model. I'd teach her about truth and integrity and standing up for what's right even when it's hard. I'd show her through example that success means using your gifts to help others, that family is about respect and honesty rather than just blood and obligation. I'd make sure she knew that she was valued for who she was, not for how well she performed or how she compared to others. And if I failed at all those things, if I made mistakes and hurt her despite my best intentions, I'd take responsibility and apologize and try to do better. That was the lesson my father had never learned, the simple, profound importance of accountability. Looking back at my life, I see a pattern of choice points, moments when I could have gone one way or another, when different decisions would have led to completely different outcomes. The thesis my father stole, when I could have fought harder or just accepted it. The years of secret development work, when I could have trusted my family with my progress. That Thanksgiving dinner, when I could have redirected Uncle Tom's question instead of letting it expose the truth. The legal complaint, when I could have pursued private resolution instead of public exposure. Each of these moments offered me a choice between comfort and principle, between loyalty and justice, between the easy path and the right one. I chose principle, chose justice, chose right, and those choices made me who I am. Was the price worth it? I destroyed my relationship with my parents, spent years estranged from my siblings, lost the family I'd grown up in. I faced social ostracism from the circles my parents had moved in, professional skepticism from people who saw me as a vindictive daughter rather than a whistleblower, personal attacks on my character and motivations. The first years after filing the complaint were brutal, lonely, filled with doubt and second-guessing. But what I gained was authenticity, integrity, meaningful work, genuine relationships, a clear conscience. I gained the ability to look at myself in the mirror and like the person looking back. I gained a life aligned with my values, work that mattered, a legacy I'm proud of. So yes, the price was worth it. I'd pay it again, knowing what I know now. Before you go, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love reading every single one. Your support means more than you know. I'll see you in the next story, and until then, stay strong, stay brave, and never forget your worth.